There is a particular kind of ambition that does not merely want success, it wants total dominance. Not a piece of the market, but the entire market. Not a share of the industry, but the industry itself, controlled from every angle, every pipeline, every railroad car, every refinery, every barrel. Most people who feel that kind of ambition are destroyed by it, because the world pushes back, competitors retaliate, governments intervene, and the laws of chance eventually catch up with anyone who overreaches. But there is one man in the history of American capitalism who came closer to achieving that total dominance than anyone before or since. A man who built a monopoly so complete that the United States government had to pass new laws specifically to dismantle it. A man who was simultaneously the greatest philanthropist his country had ever produced and the most ruthless business predator it had ever seen, and who remained, from the moment he walked into his first job at 16 years old to the moment he died 97 years into a life that had already seen empires rise and fall, the most purely focused human being ever to walk the corridors of American commerce. His name was John Davison Rockefeller, and his story is the story of what happens when extraordinary intelligence, iron discipline, and an absolute refusal to accept any outcome other than victory are concentrated in a single human being and pointed at a single goal. He was born on the 8th of July, 1839, in the small town of Richford in upstate New York, the first son of a family of modest farmers with no particular prospects and no particular plan. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was one of the most unusual characters ever to pass through the ordinary landscape of 19th century American rural life, a man known in the community simply as Devil Bill, a nickname that captured something essential about his relationship to conventional expectation. Bill was physically impressive and socially magnetic, an athlete, a hunter, a ventriloquist, a hypnotist, an animal trainer, a man of restless energy and irrepressible showmanship who once won a bear in a competition, kept it as a pet, and taught it to do tricks because that was the sort of thing Devil Bill did. What Bill did not do was farm, or maintain the family property, or provide the steady presence that his wife Eliza and their children required. Instead, he disappeared for weeks or months at a time, vanishing in the middle of the night without explanation, only to reappear without warning in a fine carriage, showering his children with gifts and toys before disappearing again, leaving behind a family that lived in a crumbling house, wore tattered clothes, and went hungry on the nights when there was not enough to eat. What none of his neighbors knew, and what his own family did not discover until much later, was that Bill Rockefeller maintained a second life under an assumed identity. Traveling as Dr. William Livingston, he moved from town to town selling herbal remedies and patent medicines to the sick and desperate, useless potions that he dispensed with the confident authority of a trained physician while pocketing the proceeds of the deception. At some point during John's childhood, he formalized this double life by marrying another woman in a different state, a second wife who had no knowledge of the first family and a first family who had no knowledge of the second. Devil Bill was a bigamist and a con artist, and the financial instability he created in the Rockefeller household fell disproportionately on his eldest son, who was expected to work the farm, contribute to the family finances, and provide the stability that his father had abdicated. John's mother Eliza was the moral counterweight to everything his father represented. A devout Baptist of genuine conviction, she raised her children on a foundation of faith, duty, and the understanding that character was built through work and tested through adversity. While Bill gambled and schemed and disappeared, Eliza plowed the fields with her children beside her, instilling in John a discipline and a sense of personal responsibility that would prove to be the bedrock of everything he later achieved. The farm work was physically demanding for a boy who had not yet reached 10, but it taught him something that no classroom could have provided in quite the same way, that the connection between effort and outcome was reliable in a way that human relationships were not, that the land rewarded those who worked it and punished those who neglected it, and that a careful and methodical approach to any task produced better results than haste or improvisation. John was already looking for additional ways to contribute to the family income before he was old enough to work in any formal sense. He followed a wild turkey into the woods, stole its eggs, raised the hatchlings, and when they had grown into mature birds, he sold some and kept the rest as breeding stock to repeat the process. A miniature business operation conducted by a boy who had not yet been exposed to any formal commercial education. He began lending small amounts of money to neighbors, noting the transactions in a ledger with the precision of a trained accountant, and he contributed a few dollars a week to the household in a regular and reliable way that contrasted sharply with the spectacular but unpredictable generosity of his absent father. When John was 10, a sexual assault accusation against his father forced the family to relocate, and the Rockefellers began the first of several moves that eventually brought them to Owego, then to Oswego, and finally to Cleveland, Ohio, which would become the city where John's adult life truly began. Throughout these years of relocation, John attended school wherever the family settled, balanced his studies against the ongoing demands of helping to support his siblings, and developed the habits of careful financial management that he would maintain for the rest of his life. He kept meticulous records of every cent he earned and every cent he spent, a practice that began in childhood and never stopped, and he gave a consistent 10% of his income to charitable causes from the moment he had income to give, a commitment that predated his wealth by decades and continued uninterrupted throughout it. By 1855, John was 16 years old, the family was established in Cleveland, and the practical question of what the next phase of his life would look like was pressing with some urgency. He had 4 siblings and a 5th on the way. His father was absent more than ever, now fully committed to his fraudulent second life elsewhere. His mother needed him to earn money immediately, not in 4 years after a college education that the family could not afford and that John had no mechanism for financing. So John dropped out of school 2 months before his graduation and began knocking on doors in Cleveland. He made a list of the largest railroads, banks, and wholesale merchants in the city and presented himself at each of them seeking work, only to be met with laughter when the men behind the desks discovered he was 16. He faced this rejection for 6 weeks, returning again and again, undeterred by the dismissal and the condescension, until a small Purdue shipping firm called Hewitt and Tuttle agreed to take him on as a bookkeeper's assistant. They told him to start immediately without mentioning what his salary would be, and John started immediately without asking, because the work was the point and the money could be negotiated afterward. For the rest of his life, he celebrated September 26th, the day he started that job, as his personal holiday of Job Day, rating it above his own birthday as the most significant date in his personal calendar. The job taught him the mechanics of real commercial operation in ways that his farm education could not, and he absorbed every lesson available with the focused attention of a man who understood that he was being given access to knowledge that most people of his background never acquired. When his boss arrived one day with a check for $4,000 and placed it in the safe whose combination John knew, John later admitted that he opened the safe when he was alone, took out the check, and stood holding it for a long time, not to steal it but to feel the physical reality of what that amount of money represented, to make it concrete rather than abstract. He was not merely dreaming of wealth in a casual or romantic way. He was studying it, trying to understand its nature and the paths that led toward it, and he was repeating to himself every morning before work the affirmation that he was bound to be rich, not as a mystical incantation but as a statement of intent so absolute that it functioned as a kind of strategic commitment. His first paycheck at the end of 1855 was $50 for more than 3 months of work, a figure that translates to barely 50 cents a day, but his bosses recognized his quality and raised his annual salary to $300, which at the time was approximately the equivalent of $11,000 in current purchasing power. The raise gave him something more important than money, because money he was already acquiring on schedule according to his own plan. It gave him independence from his father, the ability to provide his family with the stable foundation that Bill Rockefeller had perpetually promised and perpetually failed to deliver. After 2 years at Hewitt and Tuttle, John concluded that the firm's declining revenues and the illness of one of its founders pointed toward eventual closure, and that the timing was right for his biggest move yet. He had been making friends in Cleveland's commercial world throughout his time as a bookkeeper, and one of those friends was Maurice Clark, a chemist in his late 20s who was planning to start a produce trading business and suggested that John join him as a partner. John was 18 years old. Clark was 28. Together they formed Clark and Rockefeller, buying and reselling grain, fish, beans, meat, and other agricultural commodities, and John discovered in the practical environment of the business world a quality he had not known he possessed until he needed it: a calm and confident salesmanship that older and more experienced men found surprisingly easy to trust. The business grew steadily, constrained more by capital than by demand, and John and Maurice found a characteristically creative solution to this constraint by projecting an impression of greater financial resources than they actually possessed. If they needed a $5,000 loan, they would circulate word in Cleveland's commercial community that their firm was considering investing $10,000, giving banks the impression of surplus capital that made them more willing to extend credit. The strategy worked, and the loans they secured positioned them well when the American Civil War broke out and transformed the commercial landscape of northern cities almost overnight. John was a devout Baptist who opposed slavery on both theological and moral grounds, and he wanted the Union to win the war with a sincerity that went beyond political calculation. But he was also the practical head of a household with 6 dependents, a responsibility that he could not abandon for military service without consequence. He resolved this tension by paying $300 for a substitute soldier, a legal arrangement that was available under the Union Army's conscription rules, and that John supplemented by paying to equip several additional Union soldiers at his own expense. The war drove food prices to levels that massively inflated the revenues of produce merchants, and Clark and Rockefeller's profits quadrupled almost overnight. By 1862, John and Maurice cleared a profit of $17,000, a figure that in current terms represents something north of $500,000. Not bad for a 23-year-old who had entered the workforce 6 years earlier, earning 50 cents a day. The opportunity that would redirect John's entire career arrived across his desk in the form of Samuel Andrews, a young man who needed investors to build a crude oil refinery in Cleveland. The context for this opportunity was the discovery in 1859 that crude oil could be extracted from the ground in industrial quantities by drilling with a wooden derrick structure, a technique first demonstrated commercially in Titusville, Pennsylvania by Edwin Drake. Before this discovery, artificial lighting had depended primarily on whale oil, which was expensive, increasingly scarce, and subject to the supply constraints of an industry that had hunted its primary resource close to extinction. The ability to extract crude oil cheaply and in large quantities promised to solve the lighting problem for an industrializing society that desperately needed affordable illumination, and the Pennsylvania oil fields had attracted the kind of speculative frenzy that accompanies any technology capable of making fortunes quickly. Andrews had an additional advantage over most of the competition in this early period of the oil industry. He had discovered that treating crude oil with sulfuric acid would purify it and convert it into kerosene, a refined product that burned more brightly and more cleanly than crude oil, and that could be sold at a premium to the refined competitors with whom it would otherwise have to compete on price alone. John and Maurice lent Andrews $4,000 to set up his refinery and initially treated it as a secondary venture while continuing to manage their produce business. But the numbers changed that assessment quickly. Within a year, the oil refinery had become the most profitable element of the entire operation, and John could not ignore what the financial reality was telling him. He and Maurice abandoned the produce business and committed fully to oil. The oil market in its early years was one of the most volatile commercial environments John had ever encountered, and its volatility came from both directions. When new oil fields were discovered, the supply expanded rapidly, prices collapsed, and refiners struggled to earn margins on their product. When existing fields showed signs of depletion, prices surged to $14 a barrel and beyond, fueling fears that the entire industry's resource base might be exhausted. John's response to this uncertainty was to stay out of the extraction side of the business and focus exclusively on refining, reducing his exposure to the supply-side swings while maintaining his position in the value-added processing that converted crude oil into the kerosene that consumers actually purchased. Maurice Clark was temperamentally unsuited to the uncertainty that this environment demanded, and in 1865 he proposed to sell his share of the business to John. The negotiation that followed was one of the defining moments of John's career, an auction in which he and Maurice bid against each other for control of the company, and John bid $72,500 to secure the buyout, a sum that represented an enormous commitment of capital by any standard. Maurice cashed out his uncertainty for a guaranteed return. John doubled down on risk with the combination of outward calm and inward terror that would become one of his most consistent characteristics, and just as the deal was finalizing, a massive new oil field was discovered in Pennsylvania, removing the doubt about supply that had been the industry's most persistent anxiety. John was now sole proprietor of a growing oil refining operation, and he had a vision for what he wanted to build that went considerably beyond anything Maurice had been willing to contemplate. He renamed the company Standard Oil. He built a second refinery and began exporting kerosene to European markets. And he brought in a new partner whose ambitions matched his own, a man named Henry Flagler, who approached business with the strategic ferocity of a military campaign and who articulated a philosophy that John absorbed and extended, that the only way to win was to eliminate the enemy entirely, not to compete with rivals but to remove them from competition altogether through whatever combination of price pressure, strategic alliance, and selective acquisition produced the desired result. The instrument through which John and Henry began their systematic consolidation of the oil industry was the railroad rebate, a secret discount on shipping costs negotiated with the major railroad companies in exchange for guaranteed volume commitments. The railroad network of the 1860s and 1870s was dominated by three great companies: the New York Central, the Erie, and the Pennsylvania Railroad, each of which needed the oil business to sustain its revenues. John understood that the New York Central and Erie were desperate for guaranteed traffic after the Pennsylvania Railroad announced its withdrawal from Cleveland, and he used that desperation with clinical precision. In exchange for a consistent and guaranteed flow of oil through their networks, he secured a 75% discount from the Erie and a rate of $1.65 per barrel from the New York Central against an official rate of $2.40, advantages that his competitors would pay full price to match and that he would use to trigger price wars he knew he could win. The mechanics of a Rockefeller price war were simple in principle and devastating in practice. He would lower the retail price of his kerosene until his competitors, paying full transportation rates while he paid his secret discounted rates, were operating at losses they could not indefinitely sustain. When they went bankrupt or agreed to sell, he would acquire them, often for fractions of their actual value, and then raise prices again from the strengthened position of reduced competition. The cycle repeated until the competitive landscape had been reshaped according to his design. By 1872, the logic of this strategy led him to an even more ambitious arrangement, a secret alliance between Standard Oil and the three largest railroads formalized under the innocuous name of the South Improvement Company. The terms of the SIC were extraordinary in their reach. Standard would receive a secret 50% rebate on its own transportation costs. Whenever Standard's competitors shipped oil on these railroads, Standard would receive a 50% drawback from those competitors' shipping costs as well, meaning that the competitors were inadvertently subsidizing Rockefeller while paying higher rates than he did. And the railroads would provide Standard with detailed intelligence about every competitor's shipments, volumes, destinations, and pricing, giving John a surveillance capability over his rivals that no legitimate intelligence operation could have matched. The SIC collapsed within 2 months of its formation when word leaked to the oil mining community in Pennsylvania, whose members organized a boycott that cut off Standard's crude oil supply and brought the arrangement to a forced end. But the fear it had created in the industry outlasted the alliance itself, because rumors continued to circulate that some secret railroad and refiner arrangement remained in place. And John exploited that fear in the 6-week campaign now known as the Cleveland Massacre. By approaching refinery owners with a combination of implied threat and demonstrated financial strength, showing them his company's books to prove that Standard could outlast any price war while their own finances were already stressed. He induced 22 of Cleveland's 26 oil refining companies to sell their operations to him for fractions of their market value, sometimes threatening, sometimes cajoling, always methodical, always calm, always pointed toward the single outcome he had decided in advance was the only acceptable one. The recession of 1873 created conditions that would have destroyed most businesses. Oil prices fell to 48 cents a barrel, less than the cost of the equivalent volume of water. Banks closed across the country. Competitors who had been struggling before the recession now faced extinction. John, whose careful management of Standard Oil's finances had left the company with strong credit and modernized refinery infrastructure that kept costs below anyone else in the industry, regarded the crisis as an opportunity the way a skilled predator regards the weakness of its prey. He launched a nationwide buyout campaign, acquiring refineries in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York by offering struggling owners the choice between selling to him or being crushed by market forces he could manipulate more effectively than any government. When owners refused, he bought all available refining machinery and barrels to prevent them from producing. He reserved all available railroad capacity to prevent them from shipping what they did produce. He pressured the railroads to raise rates for his competitors to levels that guaranteed bankruptcy, and then he waited until they were on the verge of ruin and offered to buy them out. By the mid-1870s, Standard Oil had acquired over 90% of the oil refining capacity in the United States, a dominance so complete that the company had earned its nickname, the Octopus, a reference to the network of pipelines that stretched across the eastern seaboard like tentacles, reducing Standard's dependence on the railroads while simultaneously giving it a transportation infrastructure that no competitor could replicate. The final great corporate battle of Standard Oil's expansion era was fought against Tom Scott, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, who responded to John's consolidation of the industry by deciding to compete with him directly, building his own refineries and laying his own pipelines. John interpreted this as a declaration of war and responded with everything in his arsenal. He canceled all Standard Oil's business with the Pennsylvania Railroad and redirected the traffic. He lowered kerosene prices to reduce his competitors' revenues and therefore their shipping volumes on the Pennsylvania's lines. He pressured the New York Central and Erie to lower their rates for all shippers, specifically to damage the Pennsylvania's competitive position. The Pennsylvania Railroad was eventually forced to pay refiners to use its services, to lay off hundreds of employees, and to cut the wages of those who remained by 20%. The wage cuts triggered strikes that spread across the railroad industry and erupted into one of the most violent labor confrontations in American history, with dozens of deaths and the destruction in Pittsburgh alone of 500 freight cars, 120 locomotives, and 27 buildings set on fire by protesters. Tom Scott eventually surrendered, and John negotiated the terms of the peace from a position of complete superiority, securing guaranteed traffic proportions and secret rebates from all the major railroads simultaneously. Tom Scott suffered a stroke the following year and died, never having recovered from his defeat. His death was noted by Andrew Carnegie, who had been mentored by Scott and who blamed Rockefeller for the humiliation that had contributed to his mentor's decline, and the rivalry that had been simmering between the King of Oil and the King of Steel hardened into something more personal and more dangerous. The discovery of oil in northern Ohio in the 1880s coincided with the beginnings of Thomas Edison's push to replace kerosene with electricity for domestic lighting, and while Standard Oil's executives panicked about the implications, John recognized that the new Ohio oil fields represented not a crisis but an opportunity for the kind of strategic transformation that he had been considering for some time. He moved Standard from horizontal integration, acquiring more and more companies that did the same thing, to vertical integration, extending the company's control across every stage of the supply chain from oil well to refinery to transportation to distribution to the final consumer. He built hundreds of derricks in Ohio, laid new pipelines, and when the Ohio oil turned out to produce a refined product so malodorous that it was universally called skunk oil and refused by buyers, he hired a team of chemists to find the solution. They identified the sulfur compounds causing the smell and developed a process to remove them, and Standard became the only company selling a purified version of Ohio's oil, giving it a decisive head start when the even more enormous oil fields of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and California began producing in quantities that made the Pennsylvania fields look modest by comparison. The emergence of the automobile industry in the 1890s transformed Standard Oil's competitive position in a way that John had not specifically planned for, but that he was perfectly positioned to exploit. The refining of crude oil produced gasoline as a byproduct that had previously been treated as waste and discarded, but the automobile created a market for exactly this product, and Standard found itself with a new and rapidly growing revenue stream attached to the same fundamental operation that had always been its core business. The Depression of 1893, which closed 600 banks across the country and devastated the broader economy, barely touched Standard Oil, which generated profits through conditions that were wiping out competitors in every other industry. By this point, John had begun to step back from the day-to-day management of Standard Oil and to think more systematically about the investment of the fortune he had accumulated. His personal investment portfolio was in poor condition, a fact that surprised people who assumed that genius in one area of finance translated automatically to success in all areas. He hired a Baptist minister named Frederick Gates to manage his investments, a choice that seemed eccentric at the time but that proved inspired, because Gates turned out to possess an extraordinary business intelligence that complemented John's own in precisely the areas where it was deficient. Together with John's son, John Jr., who had recently graduated from university and who Gates trained with the same methodical thoroughness that John Sr. had applied to every enterprise in his career, Gates transformed John's chaotic investment portfolio into a systematic wealth-building operation. The most consequential of these investments was a long strip of land in Minnesota called the Mesabi Mountain Range, which contained a 120-mile vein of iron ore of the highest quality then known, potentially the largest deposit of this crucial industrial material in North America. Iron was the raw material for steel, and steel was the foundation of the industrial economy that was transforming the United States in the final decades of the 19th century. Andrew Carnegie had built his enormous fortune and his dominant position in the steel industry on the assumption that iron ore would remain accessible and affordable. When John began mining operations in the Mesabi Range and selling the ore to Carnegie's competitors at prices that Carnegie could not match, it became clear that the assumption was no longer safe. Carnegie approached John to negotiate, recognizing that the alternative was a direct competitive confrontation that he might not survive. The deal they reached was a model of the kind of arrangement that John had been making throughout his career, mutually beneficial in its formal terms while simultaneously designed to advantage Standard Oil's broader interests. Carnegie agreed to purchase a minimum of 600,000 tons of ore per year from John's mines, and to transport it along with 600,000 additional tons from his own mines exclusively through railroads that John now owned. In exchange, Carnegie received a secret rebate on transportation costs and the assurance that John would not build a steel mill. The deal generated headlines and a Wall Street frenzy, and attracted the attention of J.P. Morgan, who recognized that the combination of John's iron ore and Carnegie's steelmaking capacity could form the basis of an industrial enterprise larger than anything previously attempted. Morgan approached John about purchasing the Mesabi mines and was directed, to his considerable surprise, to John's 27-year-old son. When Morgan bluntly asked Jr. what his price was, Jr. responded with the composure of a man who had been trained by Frederick Gates and raised by John D. Rockefeller, telling Morgan that he understood Morgan wished to buy and had not come to sell, thereby placing Morgan in the position of having to make the opening bid. Morgan, who was accustomed to controlling every negotiation he entered, stepped out of his own office to reconsider his approach and eventually offered $88.5 million in U.S. steel stock for the Mesabi territory and its existing mining operation, a sum that in current terms represents something over $3 billion. U.S. Steel became the world's first billion-dollar corporation, and John owned a substantial portion of it, stock that appreciated to over $200 million as the company's scale and efficiency generated returns that validated the merger's logic. But the dominance that Standard Oil had achieved across nearly 4 decades was attracting a kind of political and journalistic opposition that could not be indefinitely resisted. Ida Tarbell, a journalist whose father had been among the oil refiners bankrupted by John's ruthless competitive practices, and whose father's business partner had taken his own life in the aftermath of financial ruin, spent years investigating Standard Oil and publishing her findings in a series of monthly articles that appeared in McClure's magazine between 1902 and 1904. Tarbell's reporting was meticulous, specific, and devastating. She documented the secret railroad rebates, the intimidation tactics used against reluctant sellers during the Cleveland Massacre, the political bribery through which Standard had purchased immunity from regulatory interference, and the personal history of Devil Bill Rockefeller, including his sexual assault accusation and, eventually, his bigamous second marriage. John's silence in the face of this reporting, his refusal to respond to any of her accusations publicly or privately, allowed Tarbell's narrative to define him in the public mind without challenge, and the portrait she painted was of a man who had built his empire through fraud, coercion, and corruption practiced on a scale that made ordinary commercial dishonesty look modest. President Theodore Roosevelt, approaching the end of his first term and looking for a cause that could generate the kind of popular enthusiasm that would guarantee his re-election, recognized in Standard Oil the perfect target for a president determined to position himself as the champion of ordinary Americans against the concentrated power of industrial monopoly. Roosevelt had already passed legislation targeting railroad rebates, but the legislation had been too limited to generate real public excitement. Standard Oil, by contrast, had been transformed by Tarbell's reporting into a genuine object of popular hatred, a symbol of everything corrupt and unaccountable about the new industrial economy, and Roosevelt attacked it with the full weight of the federal government behind him. The investigation lasted years and produced a record of evidence that was extraordinary in its scope. More than 1,000 exhibits, 444 witnesses, and over 12,000 pages of testimony establishing beyond reasonable dispute that Standard Oil was a monopoly that had systematically bribed politicians, violated antitrust laws, engaged in corporate espionage, and maintained secret ownership of ostensible competitors. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court ordered the dissolution of Standard Oil and its reorganization into 34 separate, unaffiliated companies. What John's enemies and Roosevelt himself did not anticipate was that the dissolution would prove to be the most financially beneficial event of John's career. He still owned approximately a quarter of Standard Oil at the time of the breakup, and when the 34 successor companies were opened to public trading, investors nearly tripled the value of his shares in the aggregate, recognizing that the individual components, freed from the regulatory cloud that had hung over the parent company, were each worth more to the market than their proportional share of the original had been. Standard Oil's dissolution made John Rockefeller even richer, and by the end of 1911 he was on the verge of becoming what no human being had ever been before, the world's first billionaire. He was already in his early 70s, already withdrawn from any active role in Standard Oil's operations, already thinking primarily about what he intended to do with the wealth he had accumulated over a lifetime of relentless commercial activity. The answer, which he had been working toward gradually throughout his career and which now became his primary occupation, was philanthropy on a scale commensurate with the fortune he had built. He had been giving away money since his first paycheck. The 10% tithe that he had maintained from the beginning of his working life had been a genuine and consistent commitment, not a gesture or a performance, and when critics accused his charitable giving of being a public relations exercise designed to improve his image, he continued giving anonymously as well, directing money to causes that would never be publicly associated with his name. In 1913, he formalized his philanthropic intentions by creating the Rockefeller Foundation, placing it under the management of Frederick Gates and his son Jr., the two men who had transformed his personal investment portfolio and who he trusted to apply to charitable giving the same systematic intelligence they had brought to wealth management. The foundation focused initially on medicine and education, the two areas where John believed his money could produce the greatest multiplication of human welfare. His donations to medical research laboratories helped advance the scientific understanding of diseases that were killing hundreds of thousands of people annually, contributing to the development of treatments for hookworm, malaria, and meningitis, and supporting the kind of fundamental research that would eventually underpin much of 20th century medicine. His educational philanthropy helped lift parts of the southern United States from the poverty that had persisted since the Civil War, funded hundreds of schools across the country and around the world, and endowed institutions that became among the most prestigious research universities in the world. Over the course of his lifetime, John personally gave away approximately $540 million, a figure that required his fortune to continually regenerate through investment returns in order to be sustained, since it represented more than he had earned from Standard Oil in any given period. Frederick Gates and Jr. added $537 million more through the foundation, and Jr. made an additional personal contribution of $540 million from his inherited wealth. The Rockefeller Foundation continued operating throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, directing billions more toward medicine, public health, education, and scientific research, and the total philanthropic legacy of the Rockefeller family, adjusted for inflation, ranks among the largest voluntary transfers of private wealth to public benefit in recorded history. John Davison Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937, at the age of 97, having outlived most of his enemies and all of his most consequential rivals. He had watched the automobile transform the oil industry he had built. He had seen the companies dissolved from Standard Oil grow into some of the largest corporations in American history, among them what would become ExxonMobil, Chevron, Amoco, and more than 24 others. He had seen the philanthropy he began in a small Baptist church with a 50-cent tithe evolve into an institutional infrastructure that was reshaping medicine and education worldwide. His son, who had spent his adult life managing the inheritance and extending the philanthropic mission, observed after his father's death that there was only ever one John D. Rockefeller, a judgment that captured both the uniqueness of what his father had achieved and the impossibility of replicating it. The moral accounting of John Rockefeller's life refuses simple resolution, because the qualities that made him capable of the philanthropy, the discipline, the long-term thinking, the absolute focus on the goal, were inseparable from the qualities that made him capable of the predation. The man who gave away $500 million was the same man who bought out 22 competitors in 6 weeks through a combination of intimidation and financial pressure. The man who funded the medical research that saved hundreds of thousands of lives was the same man whose business practices drove smaller operators into bankruptcy and whose father's business partner into suicide. His biographer Ron Chernow wrote that what makes Rockefeller so problematic is that his good side was every bit as good as his bad side was bad, a judgment that seems to accurately locate the particular discomfort of his legacy, the way in which extraordinary capacity for good and extraordinary capacity for harm can exist in the same person, fed by the same source. Whatever judgment history ultimately renders on John D. Rockefeller, the facts of what he accomplished are beyond dispute. From a childhood of genuine poverty in a household destabilized by a fraudulent and absent father, through a career of ferocious commercial combat in an industry that did not yet have the rules that might have constrained him, to a retirement of systematic philanthropy conducted with the same methodical intensity he had brought to everything else in his life. He moved through a century of American history as its most concentrated embodiment of both its possibilities and its contradictions. The oil he refined lit the homes of a nation. The monopoly he built required the government to create new law to dismantle it. The money he gave away built institutions that are still serving the public good nearly a century after his death. And he did all of it beginning from a 16-year-old boy who knocked on doors in Cleveland for 6 weeks before anyone would give him a chance, who celebrated the day he got that chance for the rest of his 97 years, and who from the moment he first walked into that small firm never once stopped being absolutely certain that he was bound to be rich. Thank you so much for watching this story of one of the most extraordinary and complicated lives in the entire history of American capitalism. If you found it as fascinating as we did in researching and telling it, we would genuinely love to hear your perspective in the comments below. Do you think Rockefeller was ultimately a force for good whose ruthless methods were simply the price of building something that funded an extraordinary legacy of generosity? Or was the harm he caused in building that empire too great to be offset by what came after? There is no easy answer, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about him. Your support for this channel means everything to us, and we look forward to bringing you many more stories from the history of the people and events that shaped the world we live in today. Thank you so much for watching.